Welcome back everyone to another video, and in this one we'll be talking about Google's Android team's new project Treble. Now, is Project Treble the answer to all of Android's trouble? Let's find out. So what you see on your screen right now is the Android developers blog and the blog post about something called Project Treble. Now this was posted on 12th of May. Now it's a fair bit behind Google I/O, and I was really expecting to hear something about this project on that platform, but unfortunately there was not much talk. So but they are open with it, and this is going to be a big thing coming to Android O, and I guess this is going to be a much major change than anything you can see on the face of Android O itself. So let's dig into it. So Project Treble is a way to make Android more modular, and what that means is to have a final control over Google, and so that they can push Android updates much faster and directly to the devices rather than depending upon the manufacturers, the chip vendors, or even the telecom carriers to go to finally let the Android O onto your device, which takes a lot of time. So with this approach, Google is basically trying to get Android update rolling out in a much faster pace. So let's see how they are approaching it and what is really being changed. So in this kind of flow chart, I guess we see how Android is created and then developed for the end user. So the Google first rolls out an Android release. The silicon manufacturers, or the people who make your CPUs and the peripherals that go inside of your phones, they and then the manufacturers come together and create the software that is required to run on your phone, and then that software is merged with the final product, and then it has to go in some countries, not in India but in many other countries where you have locked phones, it has to go through the carriers themselves, so AT&T, T-Mobile and all of them, to finally get to the end user. Now during an upgrade process, a similar strategy is used with Android releasing a new OS, with Google releasing a new OS, and then the silicon manufacturers adopting it, making their board support packages, which happens to be a bunch of drivers and bootloaders and all of that stuff available specifically for that release. Device manufacturers testing it with the final hardware and then pushing the release to the carriers, and then carriers finally pushing the release after everything has been sorted out to the end user. Now this of course takes a lot of time, up to a year in most cases, where there are very small percentage of devices that get the update even within 6 months of the release. I for one am still running on Android Nougat and still waiting for the 7.1 release. I am still at 7.0 on my Motorola G4 Plus, and that is the story pretty much everywhere, and with a lot of manufacturers not even pushing the updates to the users just because it costs them too much to go ahead and do the whole development process and the testing process all over again for some cheaper devices that don't have a margin at all. So this is so the next sort of a diagram which this blog post shows is how an Android OS is assembled and how it works. Now the vendor implementation creates a base. It is a bunch of drivers mostly related to the GPU, and then related to the silicon itself. For example, someone like Qualcomm would provide them with board support packages that would include their bootloaders, their chip specific packages, maybe LCD drivers, so audio drivers and all of that stuff, and then of course Adreno GPU drivers, or in case of something from high silicon or something from MediaTek, they would have separate GPU drivers provided by ARM, and then and then they're part of the boot support packages with the bootloader and all of that stuff, and that is all closed source. So manufacturers can't just get them for free. They have to pay a licensing fees, they have to pay a hefty amount and license them from the chip manufacturers to get everything working. And in many cases, uh, why we see like a big backlog of Android updates, even though the modern version would run perfectly well and it's not pushed, is at times even chip manufacturers do not push the Android update, don't uh, modify their board support packages to finally let the newer versions of Android run. So that is a big problem. Above the Android implementation, above the vendor implementation, we have the Android OS framework, and then there is a vendor interface that communicates with the Android OS framework. Now Android OS framework mostly is your Android runtime environment and stuff like that, and Java specific stuff, JVM, I think that comes under the ART. So kernel lies somewhere in between, because also kernel has to have some part of the closed source vendor implementation enabled, or at least compatible with it. And then from the Android OS framework we go to the Android apps, which is the part that the user interfaces with. Now to think of that way, that the user is never directly interfacing with vendor implementation, and it never really occurs to the user that that particular part needs to be updated. When a user says it needs its Android OS to be updated, it is not talking about the graphics driver or the Linux kernel. They are not concerned, they just need the latest Android features. So this is where Project Treble comes in. So this is before Treble, before this thing was implemented. The Android OS framework and the vendor implementation went a lot hand in hand. They had to be compiled together, they had to be compiled for each other and to work properly, otherwise they won't work. Now, and when you are releasing an Android update, you would need both of them to be present to have a matching version, to have matching APIs, and matching pretty much everything. The code needs to work together, otherwise it wouldn't work. So Project Treble makes it a lot easier. So with Project Treble, the Android team has created a vendor interface that would allow the same vendor implementation from the previous Android build to be used in the current Android build. Now instead of the Android OS itself, the Android OS framework itself being very tied down to the vendor implementation, we would have something called the vendor interface that is then tied to the vendor implementation and also tied to the Android OS framework, which would allow us to then update the Android, go from M to N or N to O without updating the kernel, without updating any binaries, without updating the GPU drivers, and without again updating your bootloaders. So the new Android OS would just work. And then this would also allow Google to directly push Android updates without waiting from confirmation from vendors or carriers, because then they would have no say, as they have no binaries that are pre-installed on the Android update, and the Android update would be completely open sourced or slightly closed source like Google wants, and that stuff would be pushed to your devices. So Android updates have always been a topic of discussion. The way Google is handling currently is not really good, and that's where other operating systems like iOS or even Windows 10 beats Google's Android. And this, with this Project Treble, Google is finally going to get things right in the department of Android updates. So if you have an Android O phone, so if you have a Google Pixel, this thing is already implemented, then again it is a Google Pixel phone. You don't really need to worry much about updates at any level. So but if you are going to buy a new phone in the recent time, make sure you buy it with Android O, and if the reviews say that it comes with Project Treble, that is what you should go for, because then it enables you to have quick updates to your Android operating system. So thank you so much guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this, and give me a thumbs up if you liked it, comment down below, and I will see you all in the next one.